23rd of May 2025. I'm reading The Last Barrier, a book by Reshad Feilds, published 1976. And I've read the first chapter, and I'm starting chapter 2 now. This is his journey in Turkey. 2. Because I love, there's an invisible way across the sky. Birds travel by that way, the sun and moon, and all the stars travel that path by night. Kathleen Rain. As the flower is the forerunner of the fruit, so man's childhood is the promise of his life. Hazrat Inaghat Khan. I spent my first day in Istanbul just walking the streets, trying to get used to the rush and the noise. Each car seemed to be sounding its horn at the same time, drivers yelling at each other in the traffic jams, and the pedestrians shouting at the drivers. Children pulled at my coat, trying to sell me candy, and on every street corner someone was selling something. There were men with suitcases full of trousers, small boys with shopping bags, and dark-skinned men from Kurdistan who pressed forward with prayer rugs from Lake Van and Anatolia. There were old men who only sold nail clippers, and on corners people huddled over red-hot braziers, roasting corn and fish caught that morning in the Bosphorus. On one side of the street, one old man offered his services as a knife sharpener, and on the other there was someone mending typewriters. At one point in my wanderings, I stood outside the Blue Mosque, surely one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, and for the first time heard the call to prayer echoing across the rooftops. It was a truly new world, exciting, exhilarating, and perhaps a little frightening for someone who had never visited Istanbul before. I had walked all day, except for the times when, exhausted, I sat down to drink Turkish coffee in tiny cafes, where men sat smoking black tobacco in hookah pipes as they watched the bustle of life pass by. Towards evening I was hungry, and in the restaurant situated in the old part of town that I had chosen for my evening meal, I decided to order kafta, tiny skewers of meat broiled over open charcoal and served with stuffed vegetables. To my surprise, I suffered no ill effects, despite the long years of having been a vegetarian. The change that I knew was to come about must have already commenced. I slept well that night in the small hotel room I had rented. In the morning, as soon as I had eaten breakfast, I began searching the telephone directory for the name Hamid had given me of a sheikh, a spiritual teacher, whom I was to visit as soon as I arrived in Istanbul. He had said that I might be able to contact the man through a group called the Société Métaphysique de Turquie, but that I might find it difficult to persuade them to give me his address, as there was always an air of secrecy about these matters. However, try as hard as I could, I drew a blank. No such society was listed in the directory, and I had really no idea where else to start looking. My difficulty was compounded by the fact that I could not speak a word of Turkish. I decided to leave the hotel and head towards Qasim, the big modern square lined with hotels, travel agencies, and airline offices, where at least one person in every office speaks either French or English. I thought that perhaps my instinct would see me through, but wherever I inquired I drew a blank, and by evening I was almost convinced that my task was impossible. If I was not a very stubborn person by nature, and if I had not trusted Hamid as much as I did, I would have given up that night. But something kept me going, and the next day I decided to search in the old part of the city, again approaching anyone who might speak English, asking if they had ever heard of the Société Métaphysique de Turquie. By noon of the second day I was no further ahead, and although Hamid had instructed me to visit another person in Istanbul as well, he had stressed that it was essential to meet these people in the order that he had given me. I was now on the point of giving up. My feet were sore and blistered, and I felt increasingly disillusioned about the whole affair when, on the afternoon of the third day, I went into a barber shop just a few doors away from my hotel to get my beard trimmed. The barber had spent 2 years working in a Paris hotel and was delighted with the opportunity to talk with someone who spoke French. We chatted about Paris and London, where he had visited briefly, and then about Istanbul. Just before leaving, I asked him the inevitable question: did he know of the society I was searching for? "Why, yes," he responded casually. "I know the society. If you like, I will take you there." How could it possibly have been so simple? After searching the city for 3 days to find the information I needed in a barber shop only a few yards from my hotel, I tried to explain the circumstances that had brought me here, but the barber merely smiled, pointing out, as had Hamid, that there was no such thing as chance, and that surely, if it were destined for me to find a sheikh, then I would, and if not, then not. Then he added, "When I was a young man, I was involved in these things, but now I have a family and a job that lets me talk to people all day long, and I do not have much time to study. They say, however, that the sheikh, who knows the people in the society, is a very great man indeed, and I hope that you will meet him. By the way, their office does not open until the evening, so perhaps it would be a good thing if you went back to your hotel and we could meet here again later." I spent the next 2 days in the hotel lobby, reading week-old newspapers that I had already seen in London, waiting impatiently for evening. The barber arrived at last, and we left the hotel and walked across the square. It was getting dark as we turned down a narrow back street. A cold wind was rising, rain was in the air. People huddled in doorways, their overcoats pulled up round their necks, the light from the lamps illuminating the steam rising through the gratings over the drains. The barber did not speak to me, but hurried along so that I was almost running to keep up with him. I couldn't tell if he had chosen a deliberately confusing route, but I knew that I could never retrace our steps alone. We reached a small square at the end of a cul-de-sac, and there, on the massive wooden door of one of the buildings, a brass plate identified the Société Métaphysique de Turquie. My companion knocked, and after a short time the door was opened by a woman in her mid-40s. Her dark hair was pulled tightly away from her forehead, knotted in a bun at the back. She wore a simple black skirt and white blouse, and looked not at all the sort of person I had come so far to meet. She glanced at me sharply, then turned to my companion. They spoke together briefly in Turkish. She stepped inside the house and shut the door. The barber gave a little bow and disappeared into the dark street, leaving me to stand alone on the doorstep. There was just enough time for my apprehension to turn to fear before the door opened again and the woman reappeared with a male companion. The woman, who spoke fair French, began to question me about my reason for being in Istanbul and about my interest in the society. I did my best to answer, but I couldn't be sure what she really wanted to know. Finally she asked, "Why do you want to visit our sheikh?" I was taken aback, until I realized that my guide, the barber, must have told her of my search. I tried to explain that my teacher had set me this task, but my explanation grew very confused. They did not seem to recognize Hamid's name and continued to question me for several minutes. The woman said abruptly, "We will go now." We took a taxi and drove through one of the oldest parts of Istanbul. It was late in the evening, the city was a blaze of lights, and the market still seethed with people. The car stopped in a narrow alley, which the buildings overhung, so far that it seemed possible for people to lean out of their upper windows and shake hands. We climbed out of the cab, rang the bell of one of the old houses and waited, looking up at the balcony. After a short while an old man appeared on the balcony wearing sleeping pyjamas. He waved to the group and indicated that he would come down to let us in. When he opened the door, he was still in his pyjamas, but he was also wearing a blue jacket. On the wall at the top of the stairs was painted a beautiful red rose, 5 or 6 feet tall. We left our shoes on the landing outside the door, and I walked into the room to meet the first of those to whom I had been sent. For at least 2 hours the sheikh talked to the group in Turkish, while his wife sat by the door, occasionally bringing more tea and sweet biscuits. During all that time he ignored me. He would look at each of the others in turn, but whenever his gaze approached me, he would turn his eyes away. As far as I could make out, they were discussing some passage from the Quran. Everyone grew very excited, and every now and again there would be shouts of Allah. At one point, everyone began crying over something that he had said. It had been about 8 hours now since I had first entered the barber's shop. Perhaps I had made some mistake and would never be allowed to greet this sheikh and know whether or not I was to be received. He might have read my thoughts, for suddenly he turned to me asking a brief, direct question, which was translated into French for me by the man from the Société Métaphysique who was sitting to my right. "Why have you come?" I began to explain, and for a while he listened to the translation as though he were very interested. Suddenly he seemed to grow bored. Lifting his hand, he stopped the conversation. There was a moment of silence, and then, looking straight at me, he began to speak. His voice and that of the translator were the only sounds in the room. Even the ever-present background of street noises seemed to fade. Once there were 2 butterflies, one in London and one in Istanbul. They flew towards each other because of love, and when they met, one died. Do you understand? There was a pause, and he continued. When the turtle lays her eggs in the sand, she scoops out a hole for them, covers them over, and then goes back to the sea. The eggs are hatched through magnetism, not just by the warmth of the sun, as people think, for the mother turtle is still linked invisibly to her eggs, even though she returns to the sea. When the eggs hatch, the baby turtles try to make their way to the water. Very few reach their destination. Waiting for them are the birds, which gather to feed on the tiny creatures, and if they do manage to get to the sea, the fish are waiting, for they too know instinctively when the turtles are going to hatch. Of the thousands of turtles that are born, very few live to return to lay their eggs. Looking at me with great kindness, he added, "So you see, the sheikh does not necessarily know who he's teaching." The group seemed very happy. Some turned to me and shook my hands, others came over and embraced me, kissing me on both cheeks. I was completely bewildered. What relationship did the turtles have to the sheikh and his teaching? What was all this business about magnetism and the sun? And if I was meant to be one of the butterflies, presumably the one that had flown from London, then was I dead? Or was it the sheikh? Before I had time to dwell on these questions, the sheikh once again raised his hand for silence. He then told the following story. Once there was a rose bush. It was carefully planted so that the roots grew deep in the soil that had long been prepared to receive it. These roots were Abraham. As the rose grew, it was necessary that it be correctly pruned, otherwise it would eventually go wild and would not fulfill the intention that the gardener had for it. The stem, through the good earth, the deep roots and the pruning, was straight and strong. That stem was Moses. One day, the most perfect red rose that had ever been seen appeared in bud. The bud was Jesus. The bud opened, the bloom was Muhammad. The sheikh paused, then turned and spoke to his wife. She left the room and returned with a small glass phial. He pointed to me and she came across the room to stand in front of me. "Take it," he said, "and tell me what it is." I took the phial in my hand and smelled it. "It is rose water," I replied. "Attar of roses. It is the essence of the rose." The sheikh smiled and beckoned me to come and sit in front of him. His presence was overwhelming. He took my hand in his, listened to me carefully. "And on your journey, remember what I have to tell you. Now mankind needs the smell of the rose. One day he will not even need that." Then he bent forward and kissed my hands, raising them together to his forehead. Putting his right hand over my head, he blew out into the room. "Who?" He got up and left the room. The meeting was over. We found our shoes and started down the stairs. Halfway down, I looked back. The old sheikh was standing at the top of the stairs, in front of the rose that was planted on the wall, was painted on the wall. He leaned forward and called down to me. The translator behind me on the stairs said quietly, "Look back once and remember, don't forget the rose." I stop this here for now. This is the first part of chapter 2. Have a lovely Friday.